Buenos días, buenas tardes, donde quiera que
Good
estén escuchando.
morning, good afternoon, wherever you
Desde
find
Alianza
yourselves
Américas
in.
les damos la
In
bienvenida
Alianza
a
Americas,
este
we
espacio de
welcome you
investigación y
to this, our
cultura en la
series
región
of
encrucijada.
Honduras
Algunos
at a
de ustedes
Crossroads.
recordarán que asistieron al
As
evento, pero
some of
también
you
lo
remember
pueden
who assisted
encontrar
at the event that
en
you could
YouTube
find in our
también
YouTube
en el
channel,
link
and we will
en
share
el
the
chat.
link in the chat.
En la primera sesión de esta
In the
serie
first
repasamos lo que
session, we
ocurrió
analyzed what
en este
happened during
periodo.
the electoral
Las
process.
elecciones en Honduras ocurren al
The
final del año
Honduran
y
elections
casi
take place at the end
siempre
of the
ganan mal
year,
y muchas
almost
veces
right before
pierden
Christmas,
para
and
darse
many
cuenta
times
qué es
you
lo que
miss
pasa
from a public opinion
en
what
ese conteo y
happens
reconteo del
within
proceso
that
electoral.
counting and
Y por eso nos
recounting
parecía
the electoral
importante en esta
votes.
primera
This is
sesión
why we felt it was
establecer
important
las
that in the
irregularidades
first
encontradas,
part to
definir
discuss
cuáles eran
the
las señales de alarma
irregularities,
y
the
cuáles eran
actors
las lecciones
involved,
que dejó
and the
esa
political
elección.
landscape left
Vale
by
la
the
pena también
election.
subrayar la
Today, we
intervención
take a step further
estadounidense
by
en
mentioning
2020
the
del presidente
American
Trump
intervention with a
de quién
nod
sería
or
su
wink
candidato
from
favorito
Donald
y
Trump
cuál
regarding who his
desafortunadamente se está
preferred
convirtiendo
candidate
en un
was,
patrón
which
en los
is
procesos electorales
now becoming a pattern in electoral
hoy
processes in Latin
advertimos
America. Today,
que
we take it a step
independientemente
further
de, digamos, los múltiples
because
hechos que están ocurriendo en muchos
regardless of
países, nos parece
multiple
importante
incidents
para
taking
Alianza
place in the
Américas, para su
international
membresía,
landscape,
para
it's
sus
important for
participantes
Alianza
en el caso
America's
de Honduras que
membership and for
participen
the people that
en
participate in the events
en la
that
situación de
participate
Honduras.
to take a
Es
focus or look at
importante
what's
saber qué
happening in
pasó en las
Honduras.
elecciones,
Knowing what's
pero
happened in the
es
elections
también
is
muy importante
important,
entender
but what matters
qué es lo que
most
va a pasar ahora en adelante,
is
cómo
knowing what's
cómo
going
va
to
a funcionar el
happen
Congreso,
from this
quién
point
va a
forward.
actuar en
What's
ese
how is the
Congreso, cuál
Congress
es
comprised now?
ese
How is the executive
agenda de
branch going to behave?
propuestas
What is this
que se
agenda
necesitan
of
avanzar,
proposals that would
qué se
make it
va a
possible
desarrollar, cuáles
to
son las
advance
amenazas.
it? What's going to be prioritized? What are the threats?
Empezó el nuevo gobierno bajo el mando de
A new
Ignacio
government
Fura
under the
y el
leadership
Partido
of
Nacional
Nasrias Fura and
y
the
el
National
conservador de
Party
derecha,
has taken the reins of
que
a deeply
toma
fractured
control del
state, a
Estado con
right-leaning party
fracturas profundas y creó
with it's a
condiciones
very
difíciles
deeply
sobre todo
fractured
en los
state. And this is
gobernantes.
important to
Es
highlight. The situation in
desafiante
Honduras
y
is
sería desafiante para
very
cualquier
challenging,
persona
and it
que
will be
asumiera
challenging for
el
anybody
cargo de
who
poder.
takes leadership
El
of the
sistema
government.
judicial cuestionado,
There is a
la
question
corrupción
judiciary,
persistente, pero
rampant
también
corruption,
muchas falencias
as
en
well
las
as lots
posibilidades de
of
abordarla de parte del
faults or
Estado.
weaknesses in how the
Un
state
Congreso
addresses all of these
extremadamente
challenges. And
complejo.
now a Congress with a complex
Y,
balance of
por
power.
supuesto, también nos
And
cuestionamos
of
cuál va a
course,
ser su
we
relación con
question
Washington
that
en medio
relationships with
de
Washington
también
within
la política
this
nacional estadounidense que
national
trata
security
de
policy from the
regresar a
US
los
that tries
niveles
to return to the
contemporáneos.
Monroe
Por eso es
Doctrine.
importante
So this is
entender qué
important
bases
to
definió
understand what
de
it
manera
will
de los países
mean
latinoamericanos
for
y
the
para
Latin
el
American
país
countries
Honduras,
and for a
que
country
ya
like
tiene
Honduras in
una
particular, which
influencia
already has a
alrededor
lot of
de la
influence
relación
and a
internacional.
relationship of collaboration with the US.
Estamos haciendo todas estas
But
preguntas
we're
porque detrás de
asking
estas
all these questions
instituciones y
because
partidos
behind these
están
description of all these
las
institutions and the
personas
parties, there are
del
people. They
Honduras.
are at the heart of it,
Estamos
the
profundamente
Honduran
preocupados,
people.
por supuesto,
We are in
por lo
particularly
difícil que
concerned
es el
by
ejercicio de la
because of
libertad de
the
expresión
difficult it is
y
to
bajo el
exercise the
análisis
freedom of
de
expression, in
este
particular
asunto
defense
tenemos una
of
figura
rights.
muy
This is
peligrosa
a
en
very
Honduras.
dangerous activity in
Vemos cómo los
Honduras.
periodistas se
We see
cuidan de la
how
censura y
journalists
temen riesgos de
self-censor
represalias por
themselves
su trabajo.
and fear reprisals for
Existe
their work.
lamentablemente la
We've
violencia contra
unfortunately
defensores
seen violence
ambientales
against
en el país
environmental
Honduras.
defenders in the country, which still
Comunidades
continues to
enteras
this day,
siguen sin
and
acceso
entire
real a
communities
la
that still
justicia
lack
y
real
continúan
access to
esforzándose por
justice,
la
who
defensa de sus
still
derechos.
makes the effort to
Todo eso
defend their
intentamos
territories. That is all
abordar
what we
el día de
will
hoy
attempt
con un
to analyze
invitado muy
today
especial
with a
que
very
queremos
special
reconocer que
guest
esté aquí
who
porque su
we
nivel
thank
de
for being
análisis
here
y su
because his
comprensión de la realidad
analytical level, his understanding of the
realmente es
Honduran reality
gracias
is
Joaquín
very
por
notable.
estar
Thank you
con
very
nosotros
much,
hoy aquí con
Joaquin,
nosotros.
for
Lo que
being here with us
pretendemos con esta
today.
es una
What we
conversación,
want to do
así
is
que
to have a
invitamos a toda la
conversation.
audiencia,
So
a todos
we
ustedes que
invite
están muy
all of you
activos
to be
en
very
la
active
mesa de enlace de
in
preguntas y respuestas.
the
Un
question
chat
and
que aparece en la
answer
parte de
section,
abajo
which should
de su
be at the
pantalla.
bottom of your screen.
Les
We encourage you to ask questions in a way to have this conversation active. For those of you who don't know Joaquin, he is a Spanish Honduran lawyer with a doctorate in human rights from the Carlos III University of Madrid. He has dedicated more than 2 decades to the defense of human rights of Honduras. He is a researcher with the Reflection Research and Communication Team, ERIC, and Deputy Coordinator of the Legal Team for Human Rights. Joaquin understands this reality not only through an academic analysis, but also through litigation, community support, and the direct defense of individuals whose rights have been violated by the state, which is what he will talk about. Joaquin, thank you for being here. No, on the contrary, thank you very much. It's almost as if I'm at home. Please let me know when I am able to start talking. Well, let's begin with a question that might seem a very general or broad question, but can help us frame this issue. When we talk about the challenges faced by hunters, what are we talking about? Are we talking about technical governance problems? Or are we facing something deeper? A problem of political will? Are we facing state capture by criminal groups? What is it that's happening in Honduras? Well, the first thing that I could say is that Honduras has four deep structural problems that have not been solved, regardless of who's in power: poverty, inequality, impunity, and corruption. That without a doubt. Which obviously, which deepens depending on the type of government that the country is having. This is why it's important to start from three ideas to understand what's happening in Honduras without unlinking it with what's happening in the rest of the world. The first great idea is that Honduras at the moment is experiencing a contexture marked by a combination of democratic fatigue and at the same time by authoritarian recomposition. And this is not that separate from what's happening in the rest of the world. In other words, democracy has been losing support from citizens, and just like Latino Barometro and the Human Rights Program of the UN during the last decade, over 13 to 15% of support in democracy has gone down. And in countries such as the Northern Triangle in Central America, which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, over 50% of the people are willing to tolerate a setback in democracy if their problems are settled. El Salvador is a clear example of what I'm talking about. A second important idea is that we're not facing a change in government in Honduras. We're facing a change in era. And this idea, we have to be have it present, because I think that we will be mistaken in the analysis that this is simply a change in government. No, it's a change in era. And the length or duration of this new decade that's beginning in Honduras will have to do with social resistance, which unfortunately are very weakened. And the third idea that's important to keep in mind is this change in era in Honduras is tied with this new wave of authoritarianism in the world, such as what's pointed out in the Gutenberg University. 3 out of 4 people, 72% of the world population, lived in authoritarian governments, and this is the highest number since 1978. And for the first time in 20 years, there's more authoritarianisms than democracies, 88. So this proposes a panorama or landscape that is not national or regional, instead it's global. And this is why in very four ideas that have to do with a change in era focused in Honduras is that we're entering 2026 with a right-leaning government, with a national Congress controlled not by one political party, instead by an ultra-conservative group with strong external influence from the US, that it's not limited to Trump's declarations prior to the elections. Instead, as you know, for March 19th, he convened the presidents from Argentina, El Salvador, Honduras, Ecuador, and who else? And one more that I'm forgetting right now, to a meeting in the US with the purpose of simply telling them, okay, let's expel China from your countries, however you have to do it. And this configures a context of establishing an autocracy because we're still seeing this in elections, and this is the progress of the far right throughout the world. A second idea, because these are four, the second idea, even if it's true that there's a questioning with the arrival of Nasri Afura as president, and he left the political field even more polarized, and citizens were even more tired and exhausted of what's happening. But Nasri Afura's government needs certain legitimacy. This makes it possible to open certain gaps that have to be leveraged before they're closed again. This happened with the prior government, Libre. It arrived with a lot of openness and it convened several dialogue tables and then it closed entirely. This will also happen with this government, and the Nazis Afura's discourse has focused on the economic growth and the battle against corruption. He has even left the door open for the arrival of the Sisi, an anti-corruption mechanism. And there's also a certain fear within the National Party to do what Libre criticized. A clear example is when they wanted to approve a law of amnesty against the coup leading general, Romeo Vasquez. And the third idea is that Nasri Asfura represents a right-leaning sector, but he's not part of this far-right sector from behind which there's Juan Orlando Hernandez, who is the ones that control the National Congress, and there will be a moment where it generates tension and one will impose over the other. And the one that winds up imposing is the one that wants to restore that political and economic power over national interest, and they will reactivate those networks of impunity and will leading to more corruption and organized crime activity. Thank you, Joaquin. I think that it's a very deep and detailed analysis, and you leave several items to discuss. The first of all, the democratic fatigue is severe. I think that the global autocracies that you're mentioning is an element that the numbers that you mention are very interesting. Let's try to go through different public branches of the public to understand what is happening there in Honduras. And let's begin with how the Congress is comprised currently. You mentioned that there's a majority in the legislative branch that's right leaning, and it'll lead to an interesting power struggle between Juan Orlando Hernandez and Nasri Asfura. Do you see a possibility to advance in legislative projects and specific initiatives? And I want to talk about that International Commission with the Struggle Against Impunity, which is the CC. It's a dream sought by Honduras, but there's never the political willpower to create the necessary reforms as requested by the United Nations for it to be implemented. What are those leaderships that we should be paying attention to within Congress? Well, in National Congress, that's that ultra-conservative bloc between the National and Liberal Party, and some congressmen and women from Libre who have joined the initiative have absolute control even to reform the Constitution and do whatever they want. As a matter of fact, they've done it very recently. They reformed the Constitution, violating the process because they did it as if it were part of a reform of an ordinary law. And this reform that they did was in order to intervene in the Supreme Court of Justice. What do I mean is that before this Constitution established that all the magistrates, the 15 magistrates of the Supreme Court, were the ones that exercised not only judicial but as well as administrative functions because there was no separate organism that was in charge of the judicial career, which was naming and removing judges. But in 2010, there was a reform where they took away from the 15 magistrates and they created a separate organism, which was the Consejo Judicatura. Within this reform, they approved a transitory reform in the sense that while they were creating this council, this judiciary council, it will be the Supreme Court president who would have the specific role of naming judges. The issue is that several years later, they created this separate organism, but the way it was created was terrible. They violated the Constitution, and there was a ruling from the constitutional branch saying that it was illegal. So they returned to the model where whoever ran the presidency of the Supreme Court had that power to name judges. So what the Congress did just now was that they did that constitutional reform without respecting the process. You needed to reform the Constitution with what purpose? To give that authority or power back to all 15 magistrates. And that is brutal interference in the judicial branch. But in summary, what they're trying to do is to distribute that role or authority where all magistrates could name judges, because before then, only the president would do that in an arbitrary fashion, somebody who currently is very attuned to what Libre is doing. So it was if there was a cake and the president would eat all the cake and would leave crumbs for the rest of them. So what the Congress did was reform it in another arbitrary way so that the cake would be distributed the way they wanted to. So they could call the magistrates that they themselves had designated and say, hey, name this judge or that judge. And this majority of congressmen and women, this ultra conservative, imposed over the rest of them. They just reformed another law called reactivation of the economy, where despite there being international rulings or sentences which say that that prohibiting firing people because of economic situations, but they imposed in this way. So right now they have the capacity to do whatever they want because they have the votes to do so, whether for laws or to do deep reforms to the Constitution. And I just last week I published an article saying that this Congress has 1 month and it has violated the Constitution at least twice without any problem whatsoever. And at the same time, on the one hand, there are organizations such as ASJ, Association for a Fair Society, or the CNA, the Anti-Corruption Institute, which in prior government were very critical and very aggressive. And right now they are completely silent. And what they're doing is aligned to legitimize what this government is doing. And at the same time, those organizations that are critical are weakened right now because they used to be the Association of Judges for Democracy, which was an organization that fought for the judicial independence, that denounced illegal allocations, with who were very critical of the current magistrate slash president of the court. They were benefited. Some of them were benefited with transfers or promotions with a proper procedure. In other words, doing what they used to criticize. And in other spaces where it was difficult for them to say something when Xiomara Castro was president, now they want to be out in public speaking and denouncing, but the political cost of not being coherent, not being as coherent as they were with Xiomara Castro, now they're suffering the consequences. So there's severe weakness in the social movement. So in that sense, I addressed the both branches, the legislative and judicial, that the legislative branch, the political and in the judicial, sorry, they have majority in the judicial, the liberal and national, because Libre has minority there, as well as they have, without a doubt, have control over the executive branch. And Libre has only around 30 congressmen and women who sell out to the conservative bloc. frequently. And when it comes to ethical terms, Libre cannot criticize after having certain attitudes, actions, or omissions that they committed when they were in power. Thank you, Joaquin. I think it's very concerning because in all the actors that you're mentioning, I see an issue with moral authority, how they don't maintain a specific position. Instead, these are positions that they take based on who's in power or who takes the decisions or if the decision will benefit them. That is a very, very big challenge in Honduras. Now, if the system of powers works properly, there should also be a system of checks and balances when you mentioned, and this is very grave that this happened barely a month later after coming into power. They are approving unconstitutional laws. The question now is, what would the court do? Would simply, what will happen when there are claims or lawsuits of inconstitutionality? What are they going to do? That's what's concerning. Now, several recourses of inconstitutionality are going to be presented because of these reforms to the Constitution, and we will see what happens because we have to take into consideration that since they have however many votes that they need, they've already announced um, political lawsuits against the member of the National Electoral Council and against the president of the court, and they can't do it despite that this figure is contrary to international norms. And the International Justice Court already said it against a lawsuit precisely against Honduras, that it is illegal. And you will surely see these political lawsuits, and they will remove the attorney general and put somebody in there of their favor. They will remove Ochoa. They will remove the president of the court as well and put somebody that favors them. It's barely 1 month with this new government, and what's coming is absolute control of the state institutions within the same logic that we had after the coup d'etat, especially, and as we saw in particular with the Juan Orlando Hernandez government, with these political or the threat of these political lawsuits. We don't know if the magistrates what they're going to do, but it will be a trial by fire. Joaquin, they are asking if you could what these political lawsuits or impeachment, why do they begin, and a bit more other elements regarding how they function within the constitutional structure in Honduras. I don't know if you recall, but in December of 2012, the National Congress, without having the power to do so, it decided to remove very arbitrarily four magistrates from the constitutional branch of the Supreme Court. It was a coup d'etat to the Supreme Court. And since it generated so much rejection, they created a political reform to install impeachment, and they created the law for impeachment. What is the problem with this figure? How it was created? It's first of all, it doesn't guarantee a due process. In all procedure, whether criminal, administrative, or legal, or political, where there's a sanction that implies removing somebody from their role or position, they should follow the guarantees of a due process for the person to defend themselves, etc. Besides this, this decision has to be able to be subject to judicial control, where an independent organism decides if the due process was followed. In Honduras, this doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, the reform clearly states that the decision by Congress cannot be subject of judicial control. 2 years ago, the Inter-American Court determined that because of the arbitrary removal of these four people and developed a series of standards where it tells Honduras that it has to reform all of its regulations to adapt it to these standards. Among these standards is guarantee that the decision of impeachment is controlled judicially to respect the due process. So this is why, at least in some sectors, we've insisted that if Congress wants to have impeachment, it first has to fulfill the Gutierrez Navas versus Honduras in order to adapt impeachment to the standards imposed there. Because if not, what could happen that people that are subject to impeachment are going to denounce or file a lawsuit against the state, and we're going to have another ruling. But these people don't care. And unfortunately, those who are demanding impeachment are organizations such as CNA, run by Gabriela Castellanos. It's very incoherent how certain civil society organizations they just fall in line with power, and now we understand why they were such fierce critics of the prior government, and now they just stay quiet and are simply legitimizing what the current government is doing. And that is the problem that we're facing right now. And since they have the necessary votes, and besides, they have the blessing from these civil society sectors, so they're going to do it because they can do it with complete impunity. It's a very serious situation, and later on, we'll ask you to talk about complying with the rulings or sentences from the Inter-American Justice Court. I think that is very important. We've talked about the state actors. What do you think about, besides the three branches in government, is there another element within the government structure that we should consider, which is not fulfilling its role that it should, or that it could provide some hope for the country? Well, honestly, currently, I think that at this moment, we are in a moment of openness from this new government, and I think we have to make the most of it. We have to go and speak, negotiate before it shuts down completely. But to being completely honest, other institutions or the supposed people's defender who has played a good role despite being somebody that belongs to the National Party and will definitely be re-elected. I don't know her case. Her name is Blanca Isaguirre. With this government and with the National Party, I don't know what decision or what position she will take. And the armed forces and the police are they have to follow the orders of the government. And the armed force, they've always tried to see the armed forces as those poor armed forces used by politicians. No, armed forces are a separate power, autonomous power within this state that has a political and entrepreneurial perspective, that has businesses with the state, that they charge to protect the forest, they charge to supervise the electoral process. It's a completely autonomous entity and are part of that elite who negotiate with the other branches of government. I honestly feel that the only solution that exists is for citizens to continue demanding for the CC to be installed. Unfortunately, there are organisms such as the ones I've mentioned who have stayed silent and no longer demand for the CC to be installed. And I think that we are at a moment where our aspirations should be the minimum one, a minimal agenda. In light of this perspective, that if you allow me, I would like to speak a bit about the international and how it plays it against us, and how the strategy that we should take is to aspire to minimum standards or minimum requirements. And one of the minimum things, and we have to focus that allow it to articulate at a national and international level, which is to demand the installation of an international anti-corruption committee. Why? Because all of the risks that are coming, and we know what these risks are, that the extractivism model will be widened, more expropriations, and in general, violations of human rights and sexual and reproductive rights, and children as well, and imposing people having to read the Bible in schools, an increase in criminalization, consolidation of an impunity pact, and the possible return of Juan Orlando once he is able to negotiate to come back to Honduras, and reform of arbitrary rules that will reform the entire system in Honduras the same way that Bukele has done in El Salvador. Joaquin, I wanted to go back to this in a way, your question, I want to link it with the question that's coming. The corruption and drug trafficking phenomenon and how it's being capturing the state or taking over the state in Honduras. The international commission, there's been several years like this beacon of hope, the way you mentioned, like an opportunity to truly address this corruption, this endemic corruption that we face. Who are the actors that bet on supporting this process? What could citizens in general do to indicate that they support this process, they want this commission to arrive? How to listen, and I want to also go back to what you mentioned about legitimacy and how those fractures or gaps and how there's an opportunity and how addressing these could be an opportunity. Yes, I think that we committed a mistake with Xiomara Castro government with Libre, that believing that from that the CC was going to be installed from the executive branch, and we saw that in Congress how Libre presented an initiative to reform the commission with a supposed purpose to bring Sisi when it was not necessary. It was not something asked by the United Nations. But behind all of this, what was happening? They didn't have the votes when they only needed 65 votes, whereas the constitutional reform that they proposed unnecessarily required 86. They obtained 82. They did it with a purpose for to make sure the CC would not arrive. I'm talking about Libre because there was a strong sector within Libre that did not want CC to arrive. So this was very clear. And the mistake by the citizens was by staying hotels, media outlets, and social media demanding it. When we have two constitutional tools, the citizens' initiative for laws, which what does this imply? That we as citizens we have to collect a specific number of signatures and present a citizens initiative in Congress to have the CCR arrive. And if Congress rejects it, then they will be left evident that they don't want it. But the process of collecting signatures is a process of democratic formation, a very good experience for citizens, with a future perspective, regardless if the Congress rejects it or not. The other one is that we have the possibility to collect signatures for a referendum. And we didn't do this because we kept waiting for the executive branch to do it, and we were tricked and deceived. So now it's our responsibility to take into consideration those constitutional tools to present those two initiatives, whether for the law or the referendum, and to cause pressure. And then we will see who truly supports its arrival or not and who rejects it, but at the very least to leave historical reference or memory that we attempted it. I think that those are very important elements of these citizen participation mechanism, which could also help strengthen the legitimacy and to fight against those elements that you mentioned at the beginning, the democratic fatigue and that autocracies. I think that those are very interesting proposals because, of course, one asks themselves of those who are in power actually fear the CC because they are afraid that they could wind up being investigated, which is it goes against their interests. Of course, we have a lot of audience in the US and we're seeing questions regarding this. So I would like to, and you said that you would like for us to speak about the role of the US. I want to allow you to speak a bit so that you can give your analysis of that power and that influence and the threats and challenges that they're seeing having Trump in power and as food as the new president. Well, the truth is that the US is doing what it's always done. The only difference is that they're doing it in an open way and with no diplomacy. I think that we have to be clear on that. And Honduras has borne witness to this. During the coup d'etat, the US was the only one that legally did not condone the coup. So of course they didn't do it openly and without any shame and without having placing a mask on. So what Trump is doing now, he just simply took off the mask and they've been doing what they've always been doing. I honestly don't see much of a difference. That's the difference, that we're seeing it in a raw fashion, that they're doing what they've always been doing. So for me, what's happening with the US doesn't represent any change. What I do think is that Trump represents a sector of the global far right, and that it's always been articulating, but now it's a stronger articulation. We have to remember that the famous Conservative Political Action Conference was created in the US in 1973. And now where does it have branches? Australia, Japan, South Korea, Brazil, Mexico, Hungary, and we've seen how who they've had as guests when they've had those meetings in the US. They in from France, far right, Meloni from Italy, twice, 2019 and 2022, Bolsonaro from Brazil in 2023, Javier Milei from Argentina, Santiago Abascal from the far-right party Vox in Spain, and Bukele in 2024, and they are constantly meeting. And that is important to keep in mind because they articulate, because they've understood that they have to win that cultural battle. And they've also understood that in Europe, the far right, that it's better to enter the EU and to throw dynamite from the inside. Here in Latin America, we're clear those few windows of justice that we had with the Inter-American Justice Court from seven. Now there are three commissioners, far right. They are very restrictive and it's causing a lot of damage. And the Inter-American, they have a few judges that are very conservative. So they are there. And on the other hand, speaking about concepts, words, terms in the cultural battle, they've created organizations such as in Orban's Hungary, they created the Human Rights Center. That's what they're called now. And this Human Rights Center has a branch in Madrid, Spain. What's the objective or purpose? If you go to their website, it's to reclassify the human rights concept because, according to them, it has been co-opted by extremist people and organizations. So they have to return to the basics of human rights in balance with families, with God, with a country, etc. And what's worst of all, only in 2024, this Human Rights Center received 11 million euros only in 2024, and only from one foundation, the Lajos Batiani Foundation, which is controlled by Orban's Fidesz party. And while these people are receiving a lot of money, as we're seeing in Latin America with certain organizations, the organizations, as always, the human rights and community organizations, we are facing a severe financing crisis, and it's leading that organizations to shut down, to that we have to take painful decisions. We have not dignified or very low salaries. So while it's a cultural war that they are winning, and with a lot of money. Just imagine that 11 million euros just for one human rights organization from just one foundation. If we were to count everything else that they receive, whereas other organizations, which are the ones that have this true commitment, we are facing a crisis and closing doors and serious problems. It's a very unequal battle, and what it seems is that we're going to lose all these battles, and we're speaking internationally or regionally. And besides all of these, the consensus that had been achieved after World War II, they are ignoring them. Let's see how There's a double standard when the application of international law. The clear example is how they apply international law. When Russia invades Ukraine, but with the genocide in Palestine, there's a complete silence where they justify that genocide perpetrated by Israel. And this is why I gave a conference a few days ago with some people in Mexico. The agony of Article 2.4 from the United Nations, which prohibits the use of force. We saw it with the invasion in Venezuela. Regardless of what you might think about the autocracy in Venezuela, how they are, what's happening in Iran, the genocide in Palestine. So, without a doubt, if you were to ask me, the landscape is devastating and we don't see any hope because it's no longer something to do with just one country or region. This is why I mentioned it at first. We're seeing a true wave of global autocracies, and they are winning the cultural battle. They are creating human rights organizations with a lot of financing. They are, whereas cutting aid or financing to our organizations, they have links with universities, with think tanks that have a lot of money. And in that sense, and on the other hand, let's see what Orban is proposing now. They take over the sense of democracy, but they say that they are building and liberal democracy, which means that theocratic states that prohibit sexual and reproductive rights for LGBT plus communities, that they say the country goes above anything else. What we're seeing in the US should not be a reference for anything with all these attacks to the freedom of expression, what ICE is doing. We are seeing a true wave of autocracies promoted by the far right, and they are dismantling those consensus achieved after World War II with all the mistakes and weaknesses, but it was the minimum that we have, and those minimums are being torn to shreds. And it would seem that Europe, with the exception of Spain, Ireland, and maybe somebody else, but Europe, and I say this also as as a Spanish citizen, also follows what other countries are ordering. We're facing a very serious consequences, and sometimes we don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. I'm sorry if I'm painting such a devastating or hopeless scenario. No, thank you, Joaquin. Thank you. It's something that we first have to understand in order to react in light of this and not to face these things that leave us without hope. What do you think would be the relationship between the US, the Trump administration, with Honduras? And there's a specific question that the audience asks if you think that free commerce trade will be signed similar to the one signed with El Salvador and Guatemala. The um, the relation will be as always the same as always. The only difference is that now we're going to have a president, President Asfura, who will not say anything. He has not said anything regarding all the atrocities that Trump has said about Hondurans, saying that they steal from Honduras with their remittances and everything else we've seen. And there's Xiomara Castro acted in the same way. They were very submissive. That the same thing with Venezuela. Xiomara Castro would say something, but they were completely submissive to the U.S. It signed up to be a third safe country. They would use Palmerola to send Venezuelan immigrants there who were deported. So in practice, so they would say something, but act in a completely different way. With this government, the only thing that would change is they would have it will be coherent with the prior government because it will simply fulfill its role of being submissive to what the US wants. I think that what you're saying is that they've taken off any masks. That is a fundamental change. We have several questions regarding migration, which is another topic that we wanted to address with you. Honduras is a country from which historically a significant percentage of its population has left to go live in the US due to the impossibility of doing it now. there are many questions with regards to where the Honduran exodus or migration flows will now head to. But at the same time, we have, as you mentioned, we have an increase in deportations. So the first question is, what is it, what implications are there for Honduras to receive those growing numbers of people who are being deported? And here I will add two elements because we had a lot to ask and time is running out. When TPS ends for Honduras, this is led to increased anguish within the community. And there was a time when they said that people voted for Asfura because they felt that following Trump's nod or approval, this would lead to better prospects for people who were TPS beneficiaries. So the question is, what will happen with them with receiving these people who have left over 25 years living in the US and without a doubt will face severe challenges when they return to the country. And then I have another question that we have regarding Honduras. Yes, we will see if this government acts smart because for the country, beyond the family tragedies implied in coming back after so many years, but these are people that are coming back with capacities and talents they didn't have when they left. So if this government acts smart, what which I think that the past government was not smart, they have to receive these trained people and they should smartly create a state program that they could leverage those installed capacities and create life conditions for these people. But we still don't know. I'm not a specialist on this subject, but from what I hear my colleagues mention, currently there's no clarity regarding what's going to happen with these people that return. If this government were to act smart, I think they could make the most of this, which is hard for people at an individual level, but it could be positive for the country if they use those capacities acquired in the US and they didn't have when they left for the US. But honestly, I think we would have to wait and in that sense. And if the situation gets worse here, I think Spain and Mexico will continue being the countries where people head to, provided that in Spain there is no change in government because in other words, the control of media outlets in Spain is terrible. At the same time, we have to accept something. And I say this, and this in and you ask me, so why do I continue doing this? At least what I did understand with these elections, we've committed a mistake of babying the population. In other words, where they take a decision that we feel isn't correct, we feel, oh, it's because it's manipulated. I don't believe that. It's conservative. And our role is to give elements for reflection and to take informed decisions. And people know who the national parties. They are completely aware of this. The people who are in the US, they know who the Liberal National Party, even if Libre is not that great. I decided not the last time I voted was in 2017 because I was tired of voting against not what I identify myself with. And I got tired of voting the same thing that happened in Spain of always voting useful vote, giving it to PSOE so that PP wouldn't arrive in power. And Dunia, my colleague, told me after the elections, there's something we're doing bad. And I said, forgive me, but we cannot blame ourselves for decisions from adults who wanted to vote completely aware and knowing who they're voting for. So I firmly believe that the population deserves the person they voted for. And this is a very simplified way of saying it. As a matter of fact, I've been studying this for a few years, why people continue voting for political parties who say they're going to take away rights from them, but people still vote for them. But what I do believe is that we have to be aware that we cannot baby the population. There are people say, oh, the media outlets manipulate you. My mother is a teacher, that a retired teacher, that every day she sees a TV channel, which is the worst thing that is available here. But she's somebody that acts consciously. So media outlets have not manipulated her. She's an adult person. So why other people who view the same channel are manipulated? What I'm getting to is that we have to be humble in acknowledging that Honduran society is conservative, that they vote, being aware of who are they voting for. I always say when you compare the number of votes obtained by the National Party right now, it's almost the same number of votes they had in 2021. There's no difference. It's very small differences. The difference was in the Liberal Party that every independent person that voted for Libre to remove Juan Orlando then voted for Salvador, and then Salvador Narrala was betrayed, and then that's where the votes. But the National Party received pretty much the same number of votes, or not that big of a difference. So we have to accept that it's a conservative society that wanted a conservative government, and what we have to do is to continue working. And wrapping up with a question, I will confess, November and December and part of January, I fell into a deep depression for two reasons. One, because of everything that's happening in the country and what's happening in the world, because as a matter of fact, I have two doctorates in the Valencia University and the Carlos III, and they all have to do with international law and international and human rights. What I'm seeing and happening in the world, where I've been litigating for over 20 years. I've published several books on the topic, that all of this, all what I studied, published, and worked on is being torn to shreds. So obviously, that's obviously going to lead me to depression. And every January, I receive students from the University of California every single year in January. And one of them asked me, they didn't ask me. I told them what I was going through, that I was disappointed because of what was happening. And one of them told me, an ex-journalist, this person studied journalism, but when Trump arrived and saw now a journalist investigation no longer removes a president because there's absolute control. So I asked this person, oh, they studied journalism because they were so disappointed. Oh, they left journalism because he was so disappointed. So I asked him, how do you feel? Because the same thing's happening with journalism as what's happening with international law. What he said was powerful. He said, I have a friend, Irish, who worked as a volunteer in a Palestine law firm in the midst of this genocide. And she asked her Palestine boss why every day she would go to Israeli courts to present lawsuits, and all of them were rejected. So she asked, why do you keep insisting if you know it won't, nothing will come from it? And she responded two things. First of all, in order for there to be historical memory or reference that we did something. And two, in order to leave them in evidence, at least in moral terms. Someday somebody will read history and say, look at what these students did. So that for me, that impacted me a lot because I was depressed from these issues, whereas other lawyers and colleagues who were facing a terrible televised genocide, how they continue doing things. So I said, I even felt selfish and small because I was getting depressed over something insignificant compared to what's happening in Palestine. So I could summarize it so that one day they will know that we just didn't do anything at all, and this way we could leave them in evidence. I want to add that the these things do not happen overnight. This constant work in denouncing and explaining what's happening, in trying to find justice and internally and internationally, are paths that we have to our long-term goals. You mentioned compliance with the rulings from the Inter-American Justice Court, which I feel is a concern, a very big concern. However, some investigations show us that sometimes it takes some time. but at the end of the day, they do wind up complying those sentences or rulings that are established, that they establish the responsibility of the government or the state. So we are facing a very challenging moment, but we cannot lose is our conviction in the values that we are defending with the struggle. And we have to continue finding ways to continue moving forward. And this is why, Joaquin, I would like to wrap up here by asking from you, what do you think that the Honduran citizens can do, those that belong to the diaspora? Where would you like for them to express themselves publicly? What is that you from Honduras like? Well, where's the diaspora? Why aren't they voicing their support with the CC, the International Anti-Corruption and Impunity Committee? Going back to the minimum aspects, because if you notice, installing a possible CC, what it seeks is to change the structures and corruption networks and impunity that lead to migration. And at the end of the day, it's all connected. So I think that demanding CC connects all, benefits one and all, and it could be a minimum agenda because sometimes we get excited and we want to change the entire world, and that's not possible. And we wind up frustrated and exhausted. So, at least during this first year of government of Nasria Fura, that should be something demanded by the diaspora to install the CC because it includes everything, including migration. Thank you very much, Joaquin. I think we'll leave it here, and I like this petition of yours to join efforts towards a common objective, which is not small, without a doubt. It's not just one thing. I would like to give thanks to everybody who participated and apologies, Leticia. I know that we didn't address the gap that regarding consular protection, in particular for those kids who have been left in the U.S. while their parents have been deported. That's something else that we could address further along in this series. You also the issue regarding remittances. That's another central focus. Thank you very much for this analysis because it has been analysis regarding Honduras, but you've also established the international context. And it's an hour where we all learned a lot and we are leaving with a task, seeking spaces to continue this work towards something new in Honduras, which is the CC. So this is where we're going to join our efforts. Thank you very much, Joaquin. Thank you very much, everybody, for accompanying us in this conversation today. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.